Let's talk about what can take you off trail when you're hiking on the Appalachian Trail. And I'm going to talk about why I decided to come home when I was doing my section hike this year. So every year, thousands of people start hiking on the Appalachian Trail with the goal of hiking the entire 2,000 plus miles. As it turns out, only about a quarter of those people actually finish that entire journey. And in fact, a quarter of those people get off trail before they reach Neal's Gap, the first milestone when you're hiking north from Springer Mountain. Neal's Gap is just a little bit over 30 miles from Springer Mountain. So why do all these people decide to leave the trail? Well, there are lots of reasons why people decide to leave the trail. I'm going to talk about those reasons and how you can avoid having those be issues for you and how you can prepare yourself to be ready for these challenges. So when I decided I was going to do this video, I sat down and I made a list of those things that were potential issues and could take me off trail. I was surprised at how many items I had on the list. Kind of refined it a little bit. I came up with 12 items that could easily take you off trail when you're attempting a long section or through hike. Those 12 items include injury, illness, being unprepared, having financial issues, being lonely, being impatient, I'll talk about that a little bit, weather, logistics issues, being unable to adapt to changes on the trail, having family issues at home, and finally I'll talk a little bit about crime and pandemics or epidemics and how they can affect the trail. So injuries are relatively common hiking on the Appalachian Trail. The trail is rugged, the surface is uneven, and it's very easy to trip or slip and fall on the trail and injure yourself. Ramdino actually reported recently that a woman had fallen and sustained a fracture of her leg and had to be evacuated off trail. Fortunately, injuries that are as serious as this are relatively rare, but falls are common. On my most recent section, I fell 4 times in about 200 miles of hiking. In fact, the last day when I was hiking downhill out of the Smokies in the rain, in the mud, over slippery rocks and roots, I went down twice and actually kind of banged up my shin pretty significantly the first time I fell that day. There are a couple things you can do to try to keep these injuries from happening. Number one, take care of yourself, take care of your feet. I think trekking poles are also a really, really good idea on the Appalachian Trail. More than 90% of hikers have them, and they are really worth having. There are so many more times that I would have fallen if I didn't have trekking poles. The other thing that can be fairly significant are overuse injuries. These include things like shin splints and blisters and lateral band strains and those types of things. In fact, one of the people I was hiking with on this section sustained a compression fracture of her thoracic spine, probably from hiking lots of miles with a heavy pack. So you have to be prepared for these kind of things. And when your body's telling you it's having problems, you need to take care of those problems. So I got one blister on my hike, and when I started to get that hot spot, it was quickly cleaned up. The small blister was drained, and it was taped up with Luca tape, and it ended up healing fairly quickly, and I had no other problem. So when you're out in the wilderness for months at a time, it's really easy to have some sort of illness. There are lots of things people come down with. There's colds and flus and norovirus, and I'll talk more about that towards the end. But more than anything, there's one significant illness that more than anything takes through hikers off the trail. The worst part about this is it tends to take through hikers off trail once they're well into their hike. And that one illness is Lyme disease. Lyme disease is widespread along the Appalachian Trail. In fact, the northern half of the trail goes through the hot spots of Lyme disease in the United States. The most common symptom of Lyme disease is just decreased miles. People are tired and they can't do the big miles they're used to doing. If you get Lyme disease, it needs to be treated with antibiotics. And the best thing to do for Lyme disease is to prevent tick bites. This includes, number one, spraying your clothes with permethrin to decrease the number of ticks that are on you, and number two, regular tick checks and removing ticks whenever you see them. The longer a tick is feeding, the greater the chances that it can transmit Lyme disease. Next on my list is being prepared for your hike. The large number of people that quit their thru hike early on, I think generally are those that are unprepared or at least don't have reasonable expectations about what the trail is going to be like. It's really important that you do your research and have the appropriate gear for your hike. This includes having gear that's going to keep you safe and reasonably comfortable, particularly early on when it tends to be really rainy and really cold. But along with that, you have to have gear that's lightweight. There's nothing worse than trying to carry a 50-pound pack up and down the mountains of Georgia. When I was at Above the Clouds Hostel, there was a young man who was rescued off the trail by a trail angel, and he was a hot mess. He had a 50-pound pack. And I think he was really disappointed. He was quiet. He wasn't talking to anybody. He had big expectations for what he was going to do on the trail, and it just wasn't working out. The trail angel took him to the outfitter at Neal Gap. He got a new pack. He got back on the trail, and I ran into him several days later. He was a new man, ready to go with the appropriate gear. I've never seen a bigger smile on somebody's face. So finances can also be an issue. I think people can be surprised by the amount of money that they can spend when they're hiking on the Appalachian Trail. You know, when the weather gets bad and you're going into town and staying at a hotel or a hostel, those expenses can really add up very, very quickly. It's easy to spend $1,000 or more a month when you're out on the trail on those types of things. Also, if you're going to be buying dehydrated trail meals, those are more expensive. And if you're buying new gear, that can be expensive. I just bought a new pack and it was $360. Loneliness can be a problem for many people. The AT tends to be a social place, so having friends and having other hikers that you talk to is really, really important to keep you. Next on my list is impatience. It's really easy to have big, high mileage expectations when you're hiking on the Appalachian Trail. Many people start out thinking they're going to hike 20 or more miles a day. They see videos of thru hikers doing 30 or more miles every day. But those kind of miles don't happen when you first start out. It's really important at the beginning of your hike to have lower expectations of the mileage that you're going to cover. I started out doing 10 miles a day between Springer Mountain and Neal Gap and quickly realized that I was pushing myself more than I should. I cut back my mileage, slowed down, and had a much better time on my hike this year. Next is weather. Bad weather is inevitable. You can't choose when you're going to be out on the trail and when to avoid storms. Not so much anyway. I found it was a good idea to go into town and take a day off the trail if the weather was going to be really bad. The other thing is there's a saying that goes, embrace the suck. That means when the weather's bad, live through it, hike through it, and manage it. I did that, and what I found I was doing was when the weather got really bad and everything got really cold and really wet, it was time to take a break and get myself rejuvenated. That worked really well. I was really surprised that this year I was able to hike all the way to Standing Bear Hostel in some really horrific weather. I put logistics on the list, not because it's a problem, but because it was an opportunity for me to get off trail. What I found this year was that I was presented with opportunities for rides to town or rides home that were very, very tempting. When we got hit by the horrendous storm at Standing Indian Shelter and went back to Deep Gap, one of the guys at the hiker feed was from Atlanta and actually offered to drive me back to Atlanta so I could get off trail. Fortunately, I ran into Smokey Bear and he talked me into just taking a day off and getting myself dried out and warmed up and getting back on trail, which is what I did. Ultimately, at the end, when I decided to go home, part of the reason I finished my hike at Standing Bear Hostel was because I had a ride to Nashville and an easy way to get home from there to St. Louis, where I live. Being adaptable is really important too. A lot of people go out and have very rigid plans on what they're going to do. In fact, it's very typical for people to plan out the first month or so of their hike and know exactly where they're going to stay and have food mailed to where they're going to be. But what people find is that plans change very quickly when you're out on trail. The weather may get in the way, or supply issues or gear issues, or anything can change your plans. So it's really important to be adaptable, be willing to change, be willing to hike less, hike more, hike different places, take a day off that's unplanned, or not take a day off that you have planned when you need to do that. It's somewhat unavoidable, but sometimes family issues can make it necessary for people to get off trail. Family emergencies are not necessarily uncommon, but they're very, very important. You may be in the middle of a very successful hike, and then all of a sudden something happens at home and you have to go home and take care of issues. One of the things about these is that it doesn't preclude you coming back and finishing. I've hiked with people who were in the middle of a thru hike and had to get off trail for a family issue and came back the next year to finish their hike. Or people go home to deal with significant family events and then come back after those events have been dealt with. Fortunately, significant crime on the trail is very infrequent and tends not to be a major problem, but rarely it can be an issue. I think it's just important to have a heads up, be watching out who you're around, making sure you're with people who you trust, people who you know, and it's very easy and very quick to find friends on the trail. If you're around somebody who's acting strange or someone that you don't feel comfortable with, you need to remove yourself from that environment. Finally, I put epidemics and pandemics on the list. I never thought I would be saying a pandemic would take people off the trail, but in 2020, it sure did. In fact, it shut down the Appalachian Trail. I don't think there's any way you can prevent that or prepare for that, although the one thing you can be ready for is norovirus. Norovirus is currently out on the trail right now. You need to be careful with food. You need to be careful with toilet hygiene. You need to be careful when you're around other hikers. You need to wash your hands a lot. So what made me decide to come home and finish my section hike when I got to Standing Bear this year? Well, there are a couple things. First of all, I was lonely. I missed being home. I wanted to be home. I had projects to do. I had some sailboat races I needed to participate in. The other thing is that I had accomplished a lot of the goals that I had set out for myself for that hike. And that even included some surprise goals like learning patience. Probably the biggest factor was that I had a ride home. And I took the opportunity to get home and not have to deal with going on a bus or finding any other kind of transportation to get myself back home. The one final icing on the cake was a gear failure. My sleeping pad developed a leak, and I realized I was going to have to take a little bit of time off trail to get that fixed, and I thought it was the perfect time to come home and get that fixed at the same time. All in all, it was a great learning experience for me this year, and I'll be going back soon. Who knows what'll take me off trail the next time I go on a long section hike.